So if the purpose of prayer, fasting, and giving wasn't designed to be used as a traditional practice, then what are their purposes? Now, I've gone back and forth about how to deliver this final video for you guys, the message here. And honestly, we're like probably halfway through Lent at this point, and I wanted to write all of these messages at the same time and deliver them all at the same time. And I've been working on them since before Lent started. And this one has really taken me the longest. But I was just trying to come up with like a clever way for you guys to understand it. And the one thing that kept popping back into my head was Paul's letter to Timothy, when he advises Timothy to rightly divide the word. And when we break that down and look at its actual meaning, it literally means to keep it straight. So I think that the best thing for us to do in this message is just to keep it straight. And the best way to do that is for us to just jump right into the word. And as we do that, there are 2 points that I want to make, like going into it. It's specifically in regard to our topic here. And the first point is within the argument between true Christianity and other religious teachers, and about how they teach that, how the other religious teachers teach that, or will say that Christian teachers teach against the law, as in we believe that Jesus abolished the law. When he fulfilled the law, somehow it abolished it, and we don't need to obey the law anymore. And that can't be any further from the truth. We actually believe, and we can see it in this sermon, that not only did Jesus uphold the law, but with his new covenant, he actually preaches a harder version of the law for us to uphold on our own. And the second thing that I think is really interesting in this portion of the sermon is that within the Sermon on the Mount altogether, there are over 20 topics that Jesus teaches on. And in Matthew, it covers the span of 3 chapters. But yet here, within 18 verses, we see Jesus teaching about prayer, fasting, and giving all together at one time. Now, to me, again, the reason why I find that interesting is because I find it as evidence that there has always been some sort of confusion in the purpose and also in how to practice these 3 things. So let's jump right into the passage. It's Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 1. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who is in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Pray then like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who is in secret will reward you. Now, it's very important here to note that prayer, fasting, and giving were super important amongst the Pharisees and within the Jewish religion. They did not approach these tasks lightly, and in many cases their entire day, week, month, season, time of the year, whatever, would be planned around making these things a priority. After all, there is a reason why they call these three things the three pillars of Jewish piety. But even though they were of such high importance, even though they had always set aside time to do them, Jesus still refers to them in this passage as hypocrites. So let's camp out here for a bit, and I think the thing about this is that the objective here is not for us to figure out how to pray or to learn what and how to give or when and how to fast. The objective is to figure out what the purpose of prayer, fasting, and giving are in regard to our faith. We'll save the how-to videos for another time. But within this passage, that's our goal, that's our objective. And to do that, I've picked out three truths that I want to share with you. And the first truth is that Jesus doesn't command or instruct us to pray, fast, and give. Not in this passage. Don't cut my head off. In this passage, he does not. There are other passages where he does. But in this passage, for this message, he does not. He assumes that we will. So if you look at the opening line, Jesus says, when you give, when you pray, and when you fast, not if you. So even though Jesus isn't recorded in this passage commanding us to do these things, he is assuming that as Christians, we will. And this is confirmed in Mark chapter 2, specifically around fasting. When other disciples, so John the Baptist's disciples and some of the disciples of the Pharisees, questioned Jesus about why his disciples aren't fasting. Sounds familiar, right? Except now we're talking about fasting instead of washing hands. And Jesus answers and says, the day will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them and they will fast. This passage also gives us a clue as to why we fast. But again, we'll talk about that another time. So, in other words, if Jesus assumes that we as Christians will pray, fast, and give, then we as Christians should assume that they are necessary. Regardless of if he's commanded us to do it, we should assume that they're necessary based on the way that he's talking about them. Second, while necessary, prayer, fasting, and giving aren't obligational. Look at how he associates the hypocrites with practicing these three things for others to see. Now, what's really powerful and eye-opening here is when we start getting into the understanding and the meaning of what it is to be a hypocrite. And I think often we associate it with someone, especially kind of out in the world. Maybe you'll invite somebody to come to church and their excuse will be, no, I'm not coming to church with a bunch of hypocrites. And so in that aspect, what we think of is someone who says one thing but does something completely different, right? And honestly, I think that that's kind of backwards. To me, I think it would be more accurate to say something like someone who does one thing but believes in something else. And an even better and more accurate definition of the word hypocrite comes if we actually look it up in the dictionary and we look at the synonyms that are associated with it. And those synonyms are pretender, imposter, deceiver, and pietist. Now, that word should sound very familiar because we've talked about the 3 pillars of Jewish piety and how these things fall under that. And we've also talked about what it means to be pious. And if you remember, it's someone who does something only because they are obligated to do it. And in the Greek, we find the word hypocrite is hypokritos, which means an actor under an assumed character. So now we're making assumptions about someone based on their character. And we've already determined in previous videos that worshiping God out of obligation like this is false worship. So we can take from this that Jesus is creating a hardline separation between obligational worship, which is what we've talked about in the past 3 videos in regard to traditions and man-made rituals and such, and something else. And this is what we call a paradigm shift. Jesus was literally introducing a paradigm shift. Now, my dad used to tell me when I was younger, when I was a kid, that a man's character is what other people think about him. But a man's integrity is what he does when he thinks no one is watching him. And that leads us into the third truth, which is that prayer, fasting, and giving are intimate. Now, intimacy, that word intimate, is a word that we're familiar with, and it's a word that can be used in several different ways. But again, when we look at the definition of the word intimate, and we kind of put together the definitions, what you end up with is something like this. A private and personal relationship with a very close friend. Now, within this passage, Jesus starts to unpack this paradigm shift, and in doing so, it reveals to us God's true design for these 3 things. And if you're not paying attention, you'll completely miss it. You'll read right over it, not even think about it, and you may have even listened to me read it and not thought twice about it. So let me look back at just a couple of things, right? In verse 4, Jesus says, so that your giving may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. In verse 6, Jesus says, when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And in verse 18, Jesus says that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who is in secret will reward you. So at first glance, we may look at that and take the fact that Jesus says, go into your room and shut the door, and then combine that with the word secret, right? As in behind closed doors. But this is where you'll miss it. In the Greek, there are 2 words that represent this word secret. One is krypte, which means in a hiding place or behind closed doors, more specifically in a cellar or a closet. But that's not the word that was used here in the original Greek transcript. The word that's used here is actually kryptos, and this translation means inward or internally. So now knowing that, if we go back and we look at these verses, in verse 4, Jesus says, so that your giving may be done internally, and your Father who sees inside of you will reward you. In verse 6, Jesus says, when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is inside of you, and your Father who sees inside of you will reward you. In verse 18, Jesus says that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is inside of you, and your Father who sees inside of you will reward you. God isn't looking on the outside like man does. God is not looking at our obedience or our efforts of giving, praying, and fasting as a performance, as the Greek translation for hypocrite as a character, as an act. He's looking at what's in our heart. This, friends, goes back to the whole doctrine of faith. When you say that you believe in Jesus, but what does your heart say? This is what Jesus was saying in his conversation with the woman at the well that we talked about in the last video. The Father is seeking those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. God is seeking those of us who will pray to him because we love him and we seek to communicate with him. He's seeking for us to fast because we want to be with him and close to him, and because we want to experience what it's like to live on him alone. He wants us to give, not because our neighbor is watching us give. He wants us to give because he wants our hearts. He wants us to give because in our hearts, we love our neighbor as much as ourselves. And we want to be like him in the fact that he gave his son for us when we didn't deserve it. Guys, it never was about performance. Prayer, fasting, and giving never was about good works. It's not a check mark. It's not something that we just do and we're done and like, oh, look at me, God, I'm done. It never was about obeying the law. It always was designed for us, as a way for us to be with God and near God and to grow intimate in a relationship, a personal friendship with our Creator. A relationship that would reveal to us his love and mercy. And through that revelation, our hearts would be so consumed with him that our response would be nothing but genuine and authentic worship. Matthew used the word proskuneo, a state in which our heart leads us to fall on our face out of amazement and reverence for our God. That is worshiping in spirit and in truth, and that is the true purpose and design for prayer, fasting, and giving. And guys, listen, if Lent, a man-made, traditionalized, obligational, perverted version of God's law, can lead you into that type of worship for our Creator, then go for it. But if it doesn't, then it's not from God. And Christians should not practice it.